This episode is on the Jacksonian Era. He is known as Old Hickory because he was like a tree that was very solid and long-lasting, right, as the hickory tree is. He was also known as the ordinary man's man, and that was because not only did he defend the ordinary man in his presidential, so he said, in his presidential politics, but he also postured with the lifestyle of an ordinary man. And he was like an ordinary man in the sense that he was orphaned as a young man. But by the time he had reached his adulthood and as he was successful as a general in the military, he had also bought a plantation. And so he was, by the time he got to the presidency, a plantation owner as well. So he's a little bit different from Jefferson in his childhood. He didn't quite have the same upbringing and he didn't have the same education, but he was in his own time a legend, a legendary general. So Jackson really dominated the early 19th century political scene, America. He was well known in his own time. This is a picture from his very early years, and I like to show what time does to people. His picture as he was as a general in the U.S. military, as his formal presidential portrait, and oh my God, look at that photograph of him in his old age. So time does a lot of damage to people. I know they say time is the savior of all things, and it does heal things, but it also does a lot of damage. All right, now let's look at the age of Jackson. I want to talk a little bit about the politics, and then we'll look at two crises for the Jacksonian administration. The politics of the era begin with the election of 1824, which is an election Jackson should have won if we were to consider the popular vote for Jackson, which went for Jackson, although he didn't have a majority since there were 4 candidates in the race. So there was no clear majority for any one candidate. And you want to see how this works out because they're going to call it the corrupt bargain. So Jackson, while he got the most votes and he got the most electoral votes, he did not have a majority. So the election had to go to the House of Representatives for decision. And in the House of Representatives, they would decide for John Quincy Adams, even though he was not the man with the majority. So the question is what happened, because everybody expected the guy with the majority popular vote and with the majority electoral votes to get the election, and that was Jackson himself. So again, most popular votes, most electoral vote, though not a majority, which means he didn't have over 50% of these votes, since there were 4 people in the running. Now, the Secretary of State is the position that is, after the presidency, the most desired one, because in American politics in this early 19th century, it tended to be that the Secretary of State would advance to candidacy for the presidency. So that's what was the most important thing about what will be called the corrupt bargain here. So as the election went to the House of Representatives, you want to know that they chose John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay as became the Secretary of State. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House at the time. So the reason that they think this was a corrupt bargain was that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, right, has a lot of influence, and they think that Henry Clay influenced the House to vote for John Quincy Adams because he had a deal with John Quincy Adams to make him the Secretary of State. All right, so this 1824 election ended with John Quincy Adams as the president, and it was, whether it was a corrupt bargain or not, this is what they put out in the rhetoric, that this 1824 election had been a big corruption because Jackson was the popular man, John Adams was not. He became president, and Henry Clay got the much desired position of Secretary of State. And so they think Clay and Adams made a deal behind closed doors. And it's very possible. that they may have done that. All right, so the American politics was in even more turmoil than it normally is, but they got a president for 4 years, and then Jackson would be elected in 1828. Right, so for 4 years they were under the Adams administration. I don't do too much with the Adams administration, but I do want to talk about the politics, the nature of politics at the time. The United States, from the get-go, we know, had a tradition of having basically a two-party system. I mean, not that there weren't other smaller parties, but the two-party system were the parties that really offered the candidates for representatives, senators, and for the presidency. So let's just remind ourselves about the two-party system. Remember, with the early republic under Washington and Adams, you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists who became Republicans, so they took the name Republican. And then as the War of 1812 ended, and many of you reminded me in your writing that the 1812 war ended the Federalist Party, and that now the United States was still divided, even though it had a lot of energy to unity, it was still divided between two parties. The Democratic Republicans, right, so there's the Republican Party itself becomes divided, and those were the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. They were the small federal government people, states' rights people. And the National Republicans. And the National Republicans were all those people that wanted to build a strong nation state, and that meant for them that the central government needed powers in order to do that. And it meant for them, too, that the central government needed to support the economy and needed to support commerce and the industrial agents of the industrial and mercantile agents of the United States. So those were the two agendas. The National Republicans were not so concerned about states' rights. In the 1930s, the American politics would get a little bit more complicated, but the two biggest parties in the 1930s would then be called the Democrats, and that's the modern Democratic Party. So they were clearly the old Democrat Republicans, and they just called themselves the Democrat. And then they took a name from the English political system, the Whig Party. And so there was a Whigs party that was had a large following, and they really had the agenda of the National Republicans. Build a strong nation, government supporting the economy, helping to build the infrastructure, right? So economic nationalism is what that term would finally be called. In each case, you have to say that neither party was absolutely against some of the things of the other party, but they definitely wanted a particular focus. Jackson was part of the Democratic Party. Right? In addition to the party system in politics, there was a transformation of politics, and the central, most important thing about the early 19th century in the United States was that the franchise, the ability to vote for people in office, was expanded. All males could vote for hold office. So all males all over the age of 18 were allowed to vote in elections. In general, the states were responsible for allowing for this, but in general, most states had been transformed by the 1830s. All males over 18 could vote, and they could also hold office. And there are some exceptions to that rule, but for the United States, the reason that I say it's the single most important thing is because it's the earliest nation state. It's the earliest nation state to have expanded voter participation or citizen participation to that extent in the world. All right, so in addition to that, you want to know that people took that right very seriously. So the numbers that we have of people voting in the United States is on the order of 80% and higher. right? So 85% of the population went out and voted on any given election. That is just amazing compared to today. Today they say we get 48 to 50% of the voting population actually participating in national elections, the big ones, and then even less, down in the 20-30% for smaller elections at the local and state level. All right, so a broad participation. They also start using what are called party machines. I know I have a colon there, but you can just call it the party machine. And what the machine meant was that they organized their parties and they contacted their voters. So they had enough organization so that they could contact voters and instruct them on how they should vote. This had its pros and cons. So we'll have the image of the party machine through the entire 19th century. And some party machines became coercive and forcing people to vote in the fashion that they would like. And in other ways of looking at the party machine, it was a way to get out information about candidates. And so in this day and age, in the early 19th century, they saw it as part of the checks and balances, that the party machine was an information system by which voters could learn about candidates, right? And party machines meant that they went out and talked to voters randomly, not just the ones that were Democrats or the ones that were Whigs, but that they tried to convince. So there was lots of information out there, and that's why they say, this party machine is not such a bad thing necessarily, that it's part of the checks and balances. When it becomes coercive, that's when it becomes a bad thing in democratic politics. All right, last thing on the transformation of politics. The administrations are now using what is called a spoils system, or prone to allow a spoils system to dominate in the appointment of people to office. And a spoils system means that you appoint your friends, or you appoint people in your party who have been great supporters of you. So either friends or great supporters will get positions in the government. This trend is part of American politics from the get-go, but it is vastly expanded by Jackson. He seems to have overstepped the boundaries of appointing people by merit into appointing people by a spoils system. And that, again, means that they are either somehow related to him, or that's a nepotism, or more importantly, that they have been a big part of the party and they are big supporters and contributors to his campaign. All right, his argument, and the argument of people who appoint just anybody to a position and don't worry about their skills, is that man of the people, that all positions in government in a democracy should be able to be occupied by anybody in the democracy, that all people should be able to not just vote, but also, as we said, hold office or even hold appointed positions in government. So that was their argument, that anybody can be a customs agent, right? Anybody can be in the tax collection agency. Anybody can be part of the law enforcement or the administration of law enforcement. Or, with Jackson, anybody can be in your cabinet, right? So government positions go to friends and political supporters. I'd said families earlier, but I should make a correction. If you're appointing family members, that's called nepotism, and that was illegal from the get-go in the United States. All right, so the challenges to the Union, the first of which is the spoils system. Here I said the spoils system. I'm not going to talk any more about it because we do talk that is a transformation of politics. It's not just Jackson, but Jackson was guilty, if I can say that. He was guilty of really appointing friends and supporters to positions because of his own philosophy that anybody should be able to. So he didn't even have a concept. There is no merit system if anybody can do anything in government, right? His cabinet, which means all of the officers that led parts of the government, i.e. the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Interior, I think it was called at that time. Anyways, all of these cabinet positions were given to friends and supporters. So for Jackson, they called it his kitchen cabinet. Okay, so that's the first and the prime example of him breaching a meritocratic system and using a spoils system in government, is the fact that he appointed friends and supporters to his cabinet. Now, he appointed friends and supporters to other positions in government, and he has a terrible time with corruption in government as well. Right? So I don't know if it's necessarily because it was friends and supporters, but they definitely paralleled each other. The spoils system and the problem and rising problem of corruption in government. One of my texts said that he had a customs agent that stole over $1 million from the United States. And I'm not sure if that's $1 million in modern terms or in his own time. I would be surprised if it was his own time. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about the spoils system. You can see the breaches in a meritocratic system, advancing people because of their talent, right? That's what meritocracy is. And that's what you would want in a democracy. Now I'm going to talk about the two other crises in the Jackson administration, a nullification crisis and how he handled it, and a banking crisis and how he handled it. The only thing that's left out of these three things that I haven't talked about and you want to read in your book is the Trail of Tears and the Jacksonian handling of the Native American question. And he certainly forces Americans or Native Americans out of their lands and west of the Mississippi, and without much consideration to American traditions or law. The Cherokee are a special example because they had contracts that said they own the land that they get forced off of. The Supreme Court sides with the Cherokee, and Jackson says, I don't care. They can enforce then their own decision, which meant he was going to send in the military to move forcefully the Cherokee out. And so you guys can have a look in your book on the Cherokee. And these are the four big things with the Jackson administration. So now that we've talked a little about the spoils system and the Trail of Tears and the forcing of the Cherokee to the west of the Mississippi, I'm going to deal with the last two, the nullification crisis and the banking crisis. And we can see what this nullification crisis reveals about the Jackson administration. It happens like this. South Carolina and the rest of the United States is in a bit of a recession in the latter part of the 1820s. And the United States government will pass a higher tariff in 1828. Now this causes a problem for people in a recession because it will force the general price of goods up very high. So that's why the South and the West were resisting the tariff of 1828. The New Englanders and the merchants liked the tariff, and especially the industrialists, because it protected their own goods from competition, from international competition. So South Carolina was the first to address this tariff, which again raised the price of tariffs in the United States. You want to know John C. Calhoun. He was in an uncomfortable position because he was the vice president of the United States, and he was also from South Carolina. So he was a South Carolina politician. Not that he was active in the legislature at this time, but he was still, a prominent politician in South Carolina, and he would side with South Carolina, even though he was vice president under Jackson of the United States. And he was vice president only for one term, partly because of this and partly because of other social things. But he was the vice president of the United States, and yet he was going to side with the South Carolina legislature, which nullified the 1828 tariff. So the legislature acts to nullify it. Calhoun's on their side as vice president, and then Jackson has a problem on his hands because he has a state that basically said it's not going to follow federal law. A tariff is a law. And so they are in a crisis, we call it a nullification crisis. And the states say, the state argument was, we have the right to decide constitutionality of things. Remember that the Constitution has the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment says that the states have the right to make laws in all areas that the federal government is not explicitly given the right by the Constitution. So as far as the states are concerned, the Constitution defines where the federal government can make law. And tariffs are not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. So South Carolina's argument is we can make a decision on the constitutionality of this law, right? And they decide, right, that we're going to nullify. You guys have a similar thing in terms of immigration policy in sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities like San Francisco have decided that they are not going to enforce federal law. And so they've basically entered into this same situation where they've nullified federal law in their city limit area. In addition to this conflict where they've decided they're not going to follow a federal law, and so Jackson's pushed against the wall. You know, what do? You're the President of the United States. You are in charge of making sure the laws of the United States are followed, and he will do that. In South Carolina, though, the second thing you want to note is they did talk of secession. So what you want to note about this is, you know, they're going to secede with the Civil War. But as we go along in this course, you want to note that the Hartford Convention talked about secession. Aaron Burr went down and tried to foment secession in the South with the Wilkinson. And here we've got South Carolina in their legislature formally thinking about, well, should we just break off from the United States? And that's what secession is, right? So the idea is in the air. So when they finally secede in 1860, it's not completely a new thing, or at least it's not a new concept by the states. All right, what happens? Right, you have a crisis, and so now Jackson has to make a decision on what to do. Remember the Democrats, right? States' rights and protection of the individual in a small federal government. So you don't want a federal government that's going to act with strength. And yet Jackson does that. So against what his party traditionally should be supported, Jackson will give the military permission to use force, and he will send a naval contingent down to South Carolina. The legislature will try to solve the problem, and they do, by lowering the tariff, right? So they will institute a new tariff and a lower tariff. And so things smooth out by those two actions. I mean, Jackson obviously is using force and then posturing with a strong federal government against the ideology of the Democrats. He will continue all the way down and reinforce the forts in the South. That was kind of prescient, actually, because he obviously already in his gut felt that there was something up with the southern region, and so that he needed to reinforce forts in that area. But things are smoothed over, right? New lower tariff, South Carolina repeals its nullification, and you're done with the crisis. So a temporary moment of tension between the federal government and a southern state, and a southern state that would lead secession finally in 1860. And that's the last thing to note about South Carolina. The banking crisis then is a little bit complex, so I've tried to break it down for you to sort of illustrate important things, but they all build up on each other. So this is really a cumulative crisis that will lead to a recession. So here's how it went. The Democrats and Jackson want to get rid of the U.S. Bank because they see it as an instrument of the wealthy, and especially the industrial elite in the North, and an instrument of a strong federal government. So this is what Jackson does. He will remove money from the Bank of the U.S. Remember, they created it under Hamilton. So he wants to dismantle it. So he takes out all the federal money from the Bank of the U.S. So I've used BUS as the Bank of the U.S. And he puts it into state banks. So he takes that money out and he puts it into the state banks. Some of them, many of them were attached to a state, but they also had private banks. So that's how banking went on in the 19th century. If you had the means and sort of the capital, you could start a bank, and then you would get a reputation if you were a good bank, and people would trust you or not trust you, right? And your bank would succeed or not succeed in that sense. So they're private, independent. Some of the states help to finance banks. So it was a pretty loose system of banking is what I'm trying to suggest. And independent banks had their own notes that they gave out for loans, and as well, notes are loans that are represented usually by cash that can be gotten, or cash, hard money, gold that can be claimed with the note from the bank. Okay, so very private system in many ways, but that's where you put the money, into the state banks, into the private banks. In addition, there's two things going on: removal of money from the federal bank, and then the selling of land that created this bubble in land prices. So there was a land frenzy. The government that has claimed and is expanding west is selling lands to individuals, and there's lots of speculators out there, meaning people who think this land's going to get very, very expensive, right? And I can buy land now, sell it later, and make a lot of money. Not too different from the 2008 housing crisis, where people were buying houses thinking they could sell it later for a higher price and make some money in it. So same thing. So lots of speculators, and lots of these speculators were buying land on loans from the banks. So with government out there with a lot of lands that it's gaining from moving Native Americans west and conquering territories and selling lands, the price of land was going up because there were lots of speculators, especially as they started to build railroads, which pushed the price of the land way too high. And then the government made a decision. So sell lands, but also take nothing but hard money. So the federal government said, we will not take anything in payment for our lands except hard money, right? And this meant that land speculators were trying to get hard money, and the banks were trying to get hard money because they too dealt with the national government. So the banks started to call in loans, ask them to be repaid, and to be repaid with hard money so they could replenish their reserves, so that they had the hard money available if they were dealing with the federal government, but in general. So basically everybody's seeking to get hard money, which means gold and silver, right? So hard money means we're not taking anything but gold and silver. We don't trust banking notes, in other words. And that depleted the gold and silver available. It depleted, actually, banking reserves, and they had to call loans in. That meant the money supply shrunk, and this is the usual path to crisis in the 19th century. Money supply is too tight, and that causes crisis, and that crisis is a recession, right? So the banks calling in loans, the federal government demanding hard money, meant that there wasn't very much money out there, not a lot of hard money, and people weren't taking banking notes. So then the currency in the economy is depleted, and that leads to recession. And that's what your crisis is. And I know that's very complicated, but that's what happened. Jackson caused a recession, and then get this. This is the irony of the whole thing, right? That in 1836 he could just veto a new charter for the Bank of the U.S. And he got rid of the bank for a good 70 years, right? And there would be no Bank of the U.S., that means no federal bank, for about 70 years, until we have, or 80 years, until they passed the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. And that just takes you out to the 20th century on a federal bank. So remember that the Bank of the U.S. was a federal bank, but there were still state banks and there were still private banks out there. So there were banks, but the federal bank was gone after 1836. And it was so easy, he could have just vetoed it instead of doing all of this calling in of hard money and creating a crisis. All right, so that's the best I can do on the banking crisis and the nullification crisis. But those are two things that happened during Jackson's administration. The banking crisis, was according to Democratic policy. So as a Democrat, he was following what the Democrats would want, which is not to have the elite wealthy people tied up with the government in a big federal U.S. bank. And the first one was antithetical to the Democratic Party, and that is the nullification crisis, where Jackson really holds down a strong federal government position by sending his military down to reinforce forts until South Carolina changes its policy on nullification. So there you have it, the big events of the Jackson administration and the striking features of this man who was a lion in his own time. So remember, it's the spoils system is expanded into all sorts of areas of government positions. He uses the U.S. military with force on South Carolina in the nullification crisis. He creates a recession by pulling and trying to stop the Bank of the U.S. by pulling money out, and he could have just vetoed it. And finally, he uses the military with great force against Native Americans who had contracts that said they were the rightful claimants to the lands in Georgia, and that was the Cherokee, and they would be forced out on what is called the Trail of Tears because the military moved them as winter was coming on, and there were many deaths in the removal of the Cherokee. The last thing I want to say about the age and era of Jackson is that we can look at debates going on at that time, and they really set up the two sides that will be argued when we get to the Civil War. So you should know a little bit about what were called the Hayne-Webster debates, two senators that were debating what the Union meant, right? And Haynes is not a surprising debate, but he's the state's writers, right? So he defended the nullification that South Carolina did with the 1828 tariff. So it was okay for a state to nullify a federal law that was intrusive and was not explicitly given to it by the Constitution. He also said that it was the South and the West against a dominant North industrial mercantile elite, right? And the South and the West were all the farmers, right? The South, its plantation holders and slave system, and the West, small farmers just eking out an existence in western reaches and the Great Lakes region and then west of the Mississippi. Webster's argument is more interesting. So Haynes' argument is well known, right? That they defending the states' rights and small farmer ideology. Webster argues, though, that the liberty, freedoms, and union were inseparable, right? And by the union, he means all the United States. So if you wanted to have, according to Webster, a nation that guaranteed the freedom of the people and the freedoms of all the people that were in the region that was called the United States, then the Union had to exist, because the Union was the institution that guaranteed freedoms to all Americans, and that if you're not going to have the Union, you're going to have a decrease or an absence of freedom in other places. This Webster position is very important when you start to ask, why do they go in to fight the Civil War and not just separate? Because And here you can get a start to the answer to that, because the thought at the time was that the Union was absolutely necessary for the welfare of the general public. Absolutely necessary. And we can talk more about that later. All right, so that concludes the Jacksonian era and some of the political debates and the political conditions and the expanding democratic base in the United States itself, and then Jackson's election, who the ordinary man really identified with him. Right? And you can read in your book, not only did the ordinary man identify with him, but when he had his inaugural ball, they called it the inaugural brawl, because so many ordinary common people came into the White House. It was just open to everybody, and they absolutely destroyed the White House at that time. So that's why they called it the inaugural brawl instead of an inaugural ball. All right, and that's the end of my episode on Jackson's era.